Hi guys, and welcome back to the next in the series in the A-level microeconomics specification. And today's criterion is evaluate the factors which determine price elasticity of supply. Key word here is obviously evaluate, therefore this is teeing you up to answer an essay style question. Now I would say the likelihood of getting this particular criterion in isolation without it being tied into some sort of synoptic theme, be that housing or oil or whatever it might be, very unlikely that you would get it just as a standalone. Let's hope not anyway, because I think it'd be quite difficult to answer such a question as a standalone question. However, if it were set in context of housing or commodity markets, then that would be a bit more like it. So let's get to it again. So let's just remind ourselves once again, ladies and gentlemen, of the whole notion of price elasticity of supply. So what is it? The equation is percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. And as discussed in my previous video, which was published yesterday, it measures the sensitivity of quantity supplied to a change in price. And that sensitivity goes from the perfectly inelastic, as you well know, vertical, to the perfectly elastic, and points in between. So here we have perfectly inelastic, here we have less than 1, so inelastic, here we have greater than 1, so elastic, and here we have PES equal to infinity, perfectly elastic. And you can see that here in this inelastic curve, significant increases in price, not very significant increases in quantity supplied, whereas in the elastic one, small changes in price bringing about very substantial changes in quantity supplied. And I discussed all of that in my previous video. So let's get to the factors which determine the price elasticity of supply. So I've got 5 here which I'd like to talk to you about. Number 1, the physical constraints and the capacity. So I mentioned this in my video yesterday. If you're talking about, let's say, St. James Park, the football stadium close by, 52,000 seat capacity. Now it's not then possible to just overnight add lots and lots more seats. Or the Sage Gateshead. So it has a certain capacity in Hall 1, a couple of thousand probably, and again there, the physical constraints of the building mean that that is the limit to the number of seats. Obviously you might be able to add 1 or 2 here and there, but it's pretty much fixed, so you get that vertical fixing at the inelastic point. Ease of substitution. So let's consider a firm which is not specializing in one particular product. It may be very significantly diversified. It might be an enormous conglomerate, for example, with fingers in many different pies. And if it's easy to substitute factors of production from the production of one good or service into another one, well, if there's suddenly an increase in the demand for a particular product, you can move resource from one production line, let's say, into another production line, thereby increasing your supply and thereby enabling the supply to respond, more quickly to changes in demand and hence the need for changes in supply. So the ease at which you can move resource from position A to position B in order to increase output of B, that will obviously be a significant and telling factor. Thirdly, the time. So for some goods, let's say Christmas trees, or anything which there's sort of quite a significant lead time, in the short term, the supply will be relatively fixed because you have to plan quite far in advance, and therefore if you're planning, let's say, next year's harvest or the harvest after that, what is planted today will determine what you reap in a year's time, 24 months' time. However, if you know in advance, obviously, and you're given a much longer lead time, then you can make sure that you are much more able to respond to perhaps the request for increases in supply because you're given that much longer preparation time. and you can plant more, therefore you know that in 2 years' time you'll be able to supply more as a consequence. So in the short term, we would say for many items the PES is inelastic, but in the longer term, if you're given more advance notice, then it will tend to be more elastic and more responsive in that respect. Spare capacity is an interesting one, so this is slightly different than capacity. So spare capacity, we mean either that your employees are simply working part-time, so they're not being used to their full potential, or your capital equipment is simply being worked on a part-time basis. Now, if that's the case, and you then, for some reason, you find that you need to supply much more, quite rapidly into the market, well, you just say to your part-time employees, okay, I'm putting you on a full-time contract, increase supply in that way, or the machinery that you're working at sort of half speed, you then ramp it up to full speed ahead, and then you increase your supply in that way. So that's another way in which you can respond to the need for increasing supply. And point number 5, stocks. So obviously stocks are costly to hold, so you don't really want to be holding a lot of stock, but especially if you're running, let's say, a corner shop, sweet shop, that sort of thing, and you obviously want to be able to meet the demand by increasing the supply if necessary. Well, if you've got sufficient stock in a warehouse or just a little storeroom, a little cupboard, something like that, then you're able to meet the need for increasing supply. And so if you've got stocks available, then that will make your price elasticity supply much more flexible and therefore much more elastic. So 5 separate items there. Let's now consider a few points of evaluation. So I'm going to just try to apply these to different scenarios which you may be faced with in the exam. And here we have a list of them. This is not a finite list by any means, just 1 or 2 that I've been thinking of as I've been preparing. So number 1, specialization. And this really links in with this determinant of ease of substitution. So very often nowadays, of course, it's the case that countries and firms, they don't really diversify in many different product areas. And so that possibility to move factors of production and resource from the production of A to the production of B, it simply doesn't exist because of the whole notion of specialization, comparative advantage, David Ricardo, as you know. So that's just something to bear in mind. Secondly, new technology and the ability of new technology to release new resources. So if you release new resources, that means that you can quite rapidly increase your supply. And we think of the oil industry, for example, fracking technology, whereby countries are now able to get an oil resource, which previously, maybe 10 years ago, it was either very, very costly to do or simply not possible. And so if you have these advances in technology, pardon me, that will make the supply relatively more elastic as a consequence. Thirdly, as I've mentioned previously, stocking is costly. And firms don't really want to do that, and of course, now that we have this sort of just-in-time method of production, whereby stocks are kept to an absolute minimum, if it's the case, for example, that our local Nissan factory suddenly found there was a massive demand for, let's say, the Nissan Qashqai, well, they could not suddenly just produce an extra 10,000 cars a week simply because the capacity, the resource is simply not there, and the stocks aren't there either. So that's something to bear in mind. Point number 4, very important point in this, particularly with regard to what's happened in the most recent Great Recession, labour hoarding and underemployment. So you'll know that in the most recent recession, rather than getting rid of employees, firms simply said, well, let's keep a hold of them, let's hoard the labour, but maybe put them on part-time contract. And so when the demand picks up again, when the global economy picks up again, we don't have to go through the whole costly and laborious task of hiring people and training people. They're already here, and we just then say, right, you're back on full-time contract. Underemployment, similar sort of thing, so you're not working to your full capacity. Now that, of course, creates and facilitates capacity. And so the whole notion of being able to increase your output when you are labour hoarding and there's underemployment, that means that PES is likely to be much more elastic, because when the global demand picks up significantly, you just put everybody back on full-time contract. And then finally, a final one here, and as I said, this is not finite, housing and planning. So we know in the UK there's a great shortage of housing. We know that there is a bit of an impetus to try and get behind house building, but we also know that in the most recent budget, the plans for house building projects were in the hundreds of thousands, and that's nowhere near sufficient. And so the supply of housing, due to the lag time, the lead time, but also to do with the planning restrictions that are set in place as well, means that the supply of housing will continue to be relatively inelastic in this country until there's some major scale up in house building. So those are just a few things that I sort of entered my mind as I was thinking about OCR, price elasticity of supply, and obviously the themes that you might encounter: housing, commodities. You might also think about obviously crops and agricultural markets, that sort of thing. But I hope that's been of use. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, thank you for getting to the end. If you're already a subscriber, thank you. If you're not a subscriber, do click that bell and hit the subscribe button. Also do follow me on Instagram, G_economics, Twitter, G_economics, LinkedIn, G_economics, and what's the other one? Oh yes, the website, geeconomics.co.uk/events. Bye for now.